Tevewona, Nahesheve, Kitcki Carroll, Natista. It is a good morning. My name is Kitcki Carroll, and I'm happy to be with you this morning. I am a proud citizen of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma. In acknowledgement of my Cheyenne relatives, ancestors, I apologize for any mispronunciations in my words this morning as I am just learning my language. I have the honor and privilege as serving as the Executive Director for United South and Eastern Tribes and the United South and Eastern Tribes Sovereignty Protection Fund, of which the Mid-Atlantic Tribal Nations are some of our newest members. Before I offer my presentation this morning, I just want to acknowledge Chief Ann Richardson. Thank you once again for inviting me here and allowing me the privilege and honor to speak with you all this morning. Thank you to all the tribal leaders from the Mid-Atlantic Tribal Nations who are in the room this morning. You are always so gracious and kind whenever I and our staff are here visiting with you. To my mother, who has instilled in me a passion for fighting for our people. And finally, thank you to all of you who are in the room here, joining us in the virtual space, and for taking the time to be here, including several staff from the USET Sovereignty Protection Fund team who are with us here today. And if you all would just stand for a moment so the audience can know who you are, please. And forgive me, I also want to thank all of the citizens from the nations of the Mid-Atlantic Tribal Nations and your staff who work so hard on your behalf. All of you who are with us today have made a commitment and worked tirelessly to improve the lives of Native peoples and to strengthen tribal nations. Improving the lives of Native people and strengthening tribal nations, that is at the core of my presentation today. Working together with fidelity to the cause, we will achieve the vision that we have for our children, our children's children, and for generations to come. This slide is a representation of our organization. I won't spend much time here. As I've already mentioned, there are two organizations, USET, who runs our program services, and the USET Sovereignty Protection Fund, who does our policy, legislative, and litigation work. That is our regional footprint where our member tribal nations exist. And then if you can see, which is probably hard from where you are sitting right now, not only is the names as listed in the Federal Register, but also the traditional names, each one of our members. So this was all indigenous land. Pre-European contact, Turtle Island, Pachamama, or any other indigenous name for these lands once were all stewarded, protected, and revered by our ancestors and relatives. Our understanding of creation, of life, our sustenance, our overall well-being were inextricably linked to these lands. Inuit, Haida, Cree, Yakima, Swinomish, Pomo, Washoe, Cree, Ponca, Hopi, Pueblo, Kiowa, Caddo, Osage, Potawatomi, Ottawa, Odawa, Ochunk, Mi'kmaq, Akwesasne, Cosati, Pequot, Wampanoag, Aniumia, Pamunkey, Rappahannock, Mattapanai, Nansemond, Monacan, and Chickahominy. These are just a small representation of many of the indigenous peoples and nations who call these lands home. Collectively, we interacted, flourished, evolved, confronted challenges, but what we began experiencing in the 15th century was the beginning of a shameful and unjust course of events that is the source of many of the challenges that we are still working to address and resolve to this day, including reclaiming our lands and rebuilding our homelands.
The story of the doctrine of Christian discovery is a story of the doctrine of Christian domination and dehumanization. That doctrine is found in documents issued by popes in the Vatican during the 15th century, which declared war on the non-Christian world and instructed Christians to invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ, to reduce them to perpetual slavery, and to take away all their possessions and property.
In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. He had 3 ships and left from Spain. He sailed through sunshine, wind, and rain. He sailed by night, he sailed by day. He used the stars to find his way. A compass also helped him know how to find the way to go. Day after day, they looked for land. They dreamed of trees and rocks and sand. October 12th, their dream came true. You never saw a happier crew. Indians, Indians, Columbus cried. His heart was filled with joyful pride. The first American? No, not quite. But Columbus was brave, and he was bright. We all recognize the story, the incompleteness of the story, and the many other untruths that followed to support the narrative that fails to account for the actions that followed. I offer these few excerpts from the Declaration of Independence as they are necessary to understand the depths of the injustice and lack of humanity that was used to rationalize and justify the taking of our lands. In this context, it's necessary to understand, before you can have a conversation about why are we rebuilding our homelands, why we are restoring our homelands, you have to understand why the circumstance is as it is to begin with. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. The promise of America, this democratic experiment that the world had never seen before, is based on achieving nationhood based on shared ideals and principles, but not like any other sovereign government, it required land as its initial foundation and more land to support further growth and expansion. George Bancroft, a Harvard-educated historian back in the early 1800s and statesman, is the architect of U.S. nationhood and identity. He believed that Americans were the people destined and divinely appointed to move westward in the spirit of expanding U.S. nationhood. In 1845, newspaper editor John O'Sullivan coined the term manifest destiny to describe the belief that God intended for the United States to occupy North America from Atlantic to Pacific. This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me. And I'm sure everybody in this room is familiar with that song. And even though that song was written in response, as a retort to God Bless America, because the composer felt that all Americans weren't equally blessed, it still reflects a belief that this land belonged to people other than us as indigenous peoples. And it has already started, but more aggressively in the years that followed, that became the charge and goal: to acquire as much land and resources as possible, regardless of the cost or consequence. And these are just examples of actions and policies that supported that growth and expansion. But tying this back to those 3 excerpts from the Declaration of Independence, all of these expansion efforts, all of them, stand in direct contrast to the self-evident truths and rights professed in the Declaration of Independence. And that's why I started out where I did. This mindset is at the core of who the United States is today. It is literally etched in stone. As one example of that, this pediment, called the Progress of Civilization, stands above the Senate doors to the U.S. Capitol. Captain Montgomery C. Meigs, the supervising engineer of the Capitol Extension Project, wrote to the artist who created this pediment, "In our history of the struggle between civilized man and the savage, between the cultivated and the wild nature, are certainly to be found themes worthy of the artist and capable of appealing to the feelings of all classes. This pediment was meant to represent the expansion of Western civilization with its tools, knowledge, and values, and the associated demise of indigenous people. But of course, through the eyes of the colonizer. But it still sits there today amongst many other such depictions. To acquire land as part of that effort, the United States had one small problem. There are already sovereign governments occupying these lands. Drawing on the doctrine of discovery, the Declaration of Independence, Manifest Destiny, all instruments meant to dehumanize indigenous people, the United States next moved with expedients to create law and policy of assimilation and termination to dispossess Native people of our lands and our natural resources. The next two slides are but two examples, but they represent two significant examples of unjust and illegal dispossession that were justified through legal fiction. The Indian Removal Act of 1830. You probably can't read that language. Its goal was simple: to get us, as Native people, out of the way. And later, when we were moved to those undesirable lands, when those undesirable lands later became desirable, to move us again. We were no longer tolerated in our own homelands, and we were forced to comply with removal. The General Allotment Act, an effort that stripped us over 90 million acres of land and then sold it to non-native U.S. citizens in furtherance of Manifest Destiny. As a sidebar, back in 2015, when the USIT Sovereignty Protection Fund was doing some work in the land space, the majority staff for the Subcommittee on Insular and Alaska Native Affairs issued a memo to the Natural Resources Committee members in advance of the oversight hearing on inadequate standards for trust land acquisition in the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. Reflected in this memo, I quote, "Under the General Allotment Act, the President was authorized to allot 160 acres or 80-acre parcels of land in Indian reservations to individual Indians located on them, and to open remaining surplus lands to non-Indian settlement. Judged as a failure today, allotment had a humane basis." 2015. Congress and activists wanted to convert impoverished Indians living on tribal communal property into property-owning farmers and ranchers who could presumably assimilate in the wider Western economy. The act failed because many Indians did not adjust or were not taught to adjust to the radical shift in their culture. So placing blame on us rather than accepting ownership and accountability themselves. Ultimately, from first contact through the modern era, millions of acres were lost. You saw that earlier slide that showed this all as red. These are the trust lands that remain today after that long, storied history. As another sidebar, another consequence of Indian land loss was the establishment of land-grant universities. Passed on July 2nd, 1862, this act made it possible for states to establish public-funded colleges funded by the development or sale of associated federal land grants. Over 10 million acres provided by these grants were the result of tribal land loss. So I would just ask the audience, don't you think, as the recipient of Indian lands, every single one of these universities should have a responsibility to tell an honest and truthful story about U.S. tribal relations, since they are the direct beneficiary of our lands? These foundational pieces that I offered in my introduction were necessary to understand what led us to where we are in Indian country. And despite the ugliness of this history, today is a new day, and we are taking back control and power over our own destiny. As it should and always has been, we are the rightful architects and painters of our own future. As part of the restoring and rebuilding tribal homelands is the Land Back movement. As the quote here reflects, depending on who you ask, it is about restoration of land ownership. It is about stewardship. It is about land claims. Regardless of how one views it, at its core is justice and righteousness, empowerment and reconnection. Earlier this week, several of the staff sitting at that table and I had the opportunity to meet with two of our members. First, we met with Chickahominy. The immense power and connection I know the Chickahominy people feel as they reclaim their lands along the river. And while I am not Chickahominy myself, I was overcome with immense emotions as I walked the Mamanuhunt property, and as Vice Chief Atkins spoke to us, he made the comment, we are reestablishing our presence back on the river. And then just yesterday, we also had the honor and privilege to see the beauty and majesty of Monacan's Fern Cliffs, property they also recently reacquired, with the strength and power of Bear Mountain rising from behind the tree line. While the efforts to reclaim our lands is not new, these images capture the current reinvigorated movement and the related energy and pride that is sweeping across Indian country. It is an empowering time, and it is a clear expression of tribal nations and native peoples taking the necessary action now to support the future we envision for our people. As the original stewards of these lands, practices such as traditional ecological knowledge will also bring healing and health to these lands. Health and healing that honors and respects the lands to ensure their long-term survival. Remarks that you heard at the introduction. And as a reflection of what is happening right now, we need not look any further than right here with the Mid-Atlantic tribal nations as proof of what is currently transpiring.
Is a harsh reality. An estimated 99% of land once belonging to North American indigenous peoples has been lost, taken through broken treaties, war, and government-sanctioned removals. Now, one piece of sacred land near the Rappahannock River in Virginia is back in the hands of its original owners. A land give
We
back.
look at the Mother Earth as our mother. And what would you do to harm your mother? The earth is in crisis right now, and people need the knowledge that we have that is thousands of years old. And that's a part of the restoration of the value and the knowledge of tribal people. The land back movement means restoration of tribes and the things that they have lost, the things that were taken, and the things that built the wealth of this nation, as it is the wealthiest nation on the planet. Began by working with some of the conservation agencies here and really advocating, because we realized that our goals for the land were similarly aligned with theirs. The work that we did to restore the cliffs, there's still 1,000 acres. There's work behind the scenes, and it's to secure this land from the tribe and not for the tribe. And then you have other partners that are working to get the land for the tribe. And so it is a battle, and I'm sure that this is not the only place that it happens. I see it really as a new era in the history of the world. She's crying out for these people to return to the land who are indigenous, who have the knowledge and the skills to take care of her. And I see that justice happening in the earth. I see it happening in law and policy, and it's very exciting to me.
The government granted us this property to be ours, and then the next year they would say, well, we're going to take 100 acres here, and then you still got enough, and then we're going to take another 100 here, and you still got enough, and until they took it all.
Here's Upper Mattaponi Chief Frank Adams.
So things are changing, so we're trying to move fast enough to save our cultural properties before our history and our heritage is destroyed.
It took 2 years for the Bureau of Indian Affairs to accept nearly 30 acres into trust. But that means it will be governed by tribal laws and not the state.
Madam President, I rise today to speak about a really important victory today, a victory for the Monacan Indian Nation, a town that he called the chief Monacan town named Rassawek. Rassawek is on a point of land, sort of the chief administrative town of the Monacan tribal nation. I started working with the Monacan and 6 other tribes when I was mayor of Richmond on this issue, because I became friends with a guy named Steve Adkins, who is the chief of one of these tribes, the Chickahominy. But Rassawek maintained its sacred status to the Monacan Nation for many reasons, including the fact that so many Monacan families were buried there, and their remains are still there. Right this historic wrong and correct an injustice, and allow these Virginia tribes, whose stories are so well known and still live in these communities, to finally be recognized. Recognize that this is a sacred site. We love our history, and we don't want to lose it. The history of our Monacan Nation, the history of all of our tribes, is worthy of battling.
And they are just getting started. The reality is there are domestic challenges to achieving our land back goals and objectives. Just yesterday and the day before, as we were having conversation with the members that I mentioned, we talked about those challenges. And those challenges will continue to grow. But it's important to remember there is United Nations international support for what you all are trying to accomplish, for what all of Indian country is trying to accomplish. After decades of negotiations between governments, and indigenous peoples, in September of 2007, the UN General Assembly adopted the United Nations Declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples, commonly referred to as UNDRIP. 144 nation states voted in favor, 11 abstained, and 4 voted against, including the United States. Later in 2010, while it did not endorse and still has not endorsed, the U.S. lended its support. The UN Declaration is the most comprehensive instrument detailing the rights of indigenous peoples in international law and policy, containing minimum standards for the recognition, protection, and promotion of these rights. It establishes a universal framework of minimum standards for the survival, dignity, well-being, and rights of the world's indigenous peoples, including all of us. And while UNDRIP is not legally binding on nation states and does not impose legal obligations on governments, like all human rights instruments, it carries moral force. In 2012, the gentleman that was on the previous slide and this slide, Mr. James Anaya, he was the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples, and he met with tribal leaders from across the country, including several from the USET region, and I also had the personal honor and privilege to meet with him to discuss our issues with his as well. Of note, not a single member of Congress concerning his investigation looking into discrimination against Native Americans was willing to meet with him. Not a single one. And in his final report to the UN General Assembly in August of 2013, he called for the US government to return some of the stolen land from tribal nations as a step toward combating continuing and systemic discrimination. So while it may be obvious to most, everything I have presented thus far leads us to the main point of this effort. Why are we restoring and rebuilding our homelands? And why is it so important to our long-term survival? It's the foundation of everything. Without lands, there is no foundation or basis for us to exert our inherent sovereign rights and authorities. Like with any government, wherever you are, it requires land as the foundation of that. And in those same conversations yesterday, we talked about these things. So as you are requiring your lands, as you are building your homelands, rebuilding your homelands, you are creating the foundation not only for what you are doing right now, but for those generations to come that we spoke of earlier. These are critical moments in your journey to reestablishing your presence, whether it's inland, whether it's on the river, wherever that may be. It is critical to that development. You heard Chief Ann already talk about conservation, stewardship. We understand these lands. We are of these lands. We are from these lands. We are connected to these lands in a way that others can't understand. They allow you to provide for the overall health and wellness of your citizenship, to allow for prideful thriving, prosperous communities. We are talking about centuries of an intentional effort to remove us from our homelands, to get us out of the way, and we are now rebuilding after those centuries of assimilation and termination. The consequences of those actions didn't transpire overnight. They happened over a course of time. So when we are thinking about rebuilding our communities, our homelands, it's a process that requires patience, that requires diligence, but it requires us standing firm on the belief that these are our lands. They became occupied lands, but these are our lands. And we all have a responsibility to make sure that those lands are cared for, that they can provide for us and our people. Sacred sites protection is part of that as well. I've already mentioned that, and it ties directly to our culture and spirituality. I'm oftentimes fascinated when I talk to non-natives, and they would never think of desecrating, disrespecting brick and mortar churches. But when it comes to a place of spirituality, that's ripe for demolition. That's ripe for disrespect, because they don't understand that. Their creation story isn't from here, but our creation stories are from here. Your river stories, your land stories, your hills, your mountain stories, your ocean stories. This is where we are from. And not only is it where we are from, it's where we will return. And that cycle continues and continues. Our ancestors are still here. They lie beneath, above us, and within us. Public safety and justice. As we are responding to the needs of our community, what does that require? It requires clarity in jurisdictional authority and boundaries, just as it does with any other government. Virginia doesn't go into the neighboring state. Nebraska doesn't go into the neighboring state. Florida doesn't go into the neighboring state. They respect that. They respect the sovereignty that exists between their two states. U.S. Canada, U.S. Mexico, any other sovereign unit you want to talk about, it's understood what jurisdiction means and the right to enforce and to make laws as you see deemed fit best for your own people, without other sovereign intervention. But that's not where we are right now. There is a widely held belief that, yeah, we'll play along with you until we don't like what you're doing. And we even heard that this week. And then it becomes a problem. And it's because at the core of that, they are not respecting our inherent government authorities and rights to make decisions for our own people as we see fit. Climate resilience and adaptation. I'm not even going to get into that. Casey, my colleague Casey, will get into that during his presentation. But that's a big part of this movement as well. And that's not only speaking about our health and wellness, but the health and wellness of our mother. Making sure that she is healthy to provide for us, and making sure that we can do what we can to slow down the effects of climate change and to bring health back to our mother. Economic development and infrastructure, a very broad category of topics. But one thing I want to say in this space, from the advocacy work that our organization does, we start from a place that the United States owes a promise to tribal nations. We are engaged in a unique and special diplomatic relation, nation to nation, government to government, sovereign to sovereign. And when you recall those earlier maps that I put up, just think about the vast wealth associated with those lands and natural resources, that the United States continues to be a beneficiary of today, and how everybody who occupies these lands are a direct beneficiary of that history. People don't remember that because they're not told that in their history. But if you are here, you are a beneficiary of that history. But you can't unwind time. We understand that. But it's important to underscore that these lands that the United States now possess was made with a promise. And as for as long as we have been in this relationship, there has never been a moment in history where the United States has honored that promise. Never. But it still holds the assets. So from an advocacy standpoint, we will always advocate for the U.S. honoring those promises, which means full funding to Indian country. But not only does it mean full funding for Indian country, it means get off your back. So when we send the billions of dollars overseas that we do in international support, it's not with quarterly reports, it's not with SFRs, FSRs, it's not with logic models, but that's what all of you do to get those promises made to you. And if you don't do it right, what do they tell you? Sorry, you may not get your funds anymore. If you don't have a clean single audit, you may not get your funds anymore. In what reality, maybe twisted reality, does that make sense? This, as you heard Chief Ann make in her remarks in that video, this is the most wealthy government nation the world has ever known. And you can't pay your bill to the first people of these lands, and in payment for the lands that you took and now benefit from? This is the story when we talk about untold truths. This is the story. This is the narrative that they don't want to tell you. So they will tell you it's difficult for them to find $1 million for a project that you have, but no disrespect intended to our friends and relatives who are suffering in the Ukraine situation. We've sent $6 billion to aid the Ukraine situation since that fight began. $6 billion. Do you know that equals the same amount for Indian Health Services and BIA in a normal year together? And they found it like that. Yet you all have to justify your needs to the United States. While we have rampant unemployment in Indian country, 85% in some places. Average life of 45 years old in some places for men. Out of control diabetes. People unnecessarily dying because of priority systems within the Indian Health Service system. Missing and murdered Indigenous women because there isn't proper law enforcement and justice to respond to that because of decisions that they made in their Major Crimes Act about who had enforcement authority. These are all things that we are still dealing with. So rather than just rely on somebody who may be very slow in ever arriving at that moment, that's not what we're about. We've been doing this long enough to know what this dance is all about. And so when you hear me talk about empowering times, this is an empowering time. We understand the game now. We get it. But we're not going to be manipulated by it any longer. We are taking back control. We are our architects of what that future is going to look like. So while we will continue to push as aggressively as we can for those promises to be made, you don't take out a loan without paying your debt, right? You'll have auditors come to your door if you don't pay your debt. But as an alternative, you see tribes getting into the economic development space and what that means to complement those unfulfilled obligations, not to replace them, to complement them. And then the infrastructure that goes along with that. For many of you in this room, you are rebuilding from the beginning. Roads, hospitals, clinics, schools, daycare providers, senior centers, libraries, small businesses, after-school program facilities. You are having to create all of that. And while that can seem like a Herculean responsibility, it's inspiring. You have the power right now to be setting the course of the direction for all your relatives who will come behind you. And those decisions that you are making right now will ensure the brightness of their future. That is an empowering thing once you recognize it. But the thing that I wanted to park on within this economic development space is this is not new. So while capitalism is a consequence of the way that this country was structured, economies, economic development, building, trade, commerce existed way before there was a United States. We weren't just here sitting on our hands doing nothing all day long, despite what they may want you to think. Us merciless Indian savages who are only concerned with warfare and killing. We were productive societies evolving just like anybody else.
Native Americans have been asking people to recognize our rights since before 1879, when Chief Joseph said, "Let me be a free man, free to travel, free to stop, free to work, free to trade where I choose, free to choose my own teachers, free to follow the religion of my fathers, free to talk, think, and act for myself." Early in the history of the United States, we lost sovereignty over our lives and jurisdiction over our land. The federal government forced us onto reservations, declared us wards of the state, and stripped us of our dignity. The federal government restricts individual and tribal rights to this day. This is the main reason why we are the poorest in the United States. But it was not always that way. Prior to European contact, Indigenous peoples had a long history of the dynamic economies and governance structures that we recognize today as the necessary ingredients for prosperity. Native Americans claimed their territories, made capital investments, and rewarded individual initiative. Societies considered land to be owned communally. Individuals, families, and clans were generally entitled to the benefits of their work on that land. In the Southeast, families and clans owned cultivated gardens and orchards. Farther north, people marked trees to denote tribal boundaries, important pathways, and to claim forests for hunting, trapping, and timber. Trade fostered prosperity, allowing many tribes to devote significant time and resources to leisure, art, and religious ceremonies. To support all of this economic activity, tribal governments evolved to fit regional conditions consistent with their customs and culture. This enabled indigenous economies to adapt successfully to climate and technological changes. Indigenous traditions of treaty making and trade allowed Native Americans to adapt and prosper by trading with Europeans who brought beads, steel, horses, and other new commodities. Long before colonization, robust trade networks connected tribes and the goods they produced. Native Americans didn't simply survive, they thrived. Eventually, however, as European settlement expanded, these dynamic, decentralized indigenous institutions were forcibly replaced by centralized federal authority. This had dire consequences for Native Americans. Tribes were driven from their traditional territories and onto reservations where tribal practices like the Sundance and potlatch were banned. What was once a relatively free, prosperous, and open society of indigenous economies was replaced with top-down federal control that stripped us of our autonomy, dignity, and sources of wealth.
As it is for any other sovereign, economic sovereignty is essential to Indian country's ability to be self-determining and self-sufficient. Rebuilding our tribal nations involves the rebuilding of our tribal economies as a core foundation of healthy and productive communities. One of the things I just want to share as an aside here, one of the important things is to not only show that for our benefit, the work that you do within each one of your respective tribal nations absolutely is for the benefit of surrounding communities around you. So as we are having these conversations and you're experiencing these challenges of local, state, county pushback, they have a responsibility to understand that your success is for their benefit. Because what we know to occur across Indian country when we create employment opportunities, it's not just for us. Our enterprises are providing job opportunities for non-natives as well. And all those dollars being generated are going into local economies, whether directly right there on tribal lands or in surrounding communities. So when you experience opposition to that, the real opposition isn't to the endeavor. The real opposition is the inherent sovereign rights and authorities that you're exerting. You are taking power back, and that is an uncomfortable thing for far too many. We spent some time today talking about current status. We also have a responsibility to think beyond just the present. So one of the ways of which you have more authority over your lands is through the fee to trust status. And you'll hear more about that later this morning or this afternoon when Wizipan presents to you from DOI. It's a part of the process, right? It allows you to take your fee simple land that you pay taxes on to the state, put it into land status, trust status with the United States. But it is still trust land status. And one of the important things to understand about that, just as the overall U.S. tribal relationship is based upon this trust model, a model that is paternalistic and antiquated, trust is part of that. Does the United States have responsibility to tribes? Absolutely, unquestioned. I would never make an issue of that. But how you term that and speak about that relationship matters. So what people don't understand about trust land status, by definition, it means beneficial occupancy. The United States owns it, but you then become the beneficial occupant of those federal lands. It's progress away from the fee simple model, but we need to be envisioning and thinking bigger than that, where we own the land outright. It's ours. We should have full jurisdictional authorities, rights over those lands. Nobody else. Go back to our original discussion on what sovereignty means and any other sovereign that you think about. Nobody else is dictating to them what they are doing for their citizens. We should be in that same place. There are 3 sovereigns in this country: tribal nations, states, the United States. In that order, we were here first. So fee to trust is one of them. Right now, you are all too familiar with the concept of consultation. Consult, 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 consult. We'll listen to you. But we may not respond to what you want. We may listen, but do whatever we want regardless. Going back to the UN, to UNDRIP, embedded in that is the idea of consent. Nothing should be happening in your homelands unless you consent to it. And if you do not consent to it, that is a violation of your rights. That's the way that it should be. So while consultation is positive and moving in the right direction, consent, is the next objective before we get to the larger objective. One thing I just want to throw out there, and this goes back to my comment a little bit earlier on the amount that we send in foreign aid every single year, billions and billions and billions of dollars. At the end of World War II, the United States, in current dollar value, invested about $1 trillion in the rebuilding of Europe, of European nations, because of all the destruction that resulted from the war. That investment into Europe post-World War II was referred to as the Marshall Plan. The United States understood, because of its direct involvement of that in that war and the consequences of that war, and to bring peace back to the world stage, to incentivize trade, commerce, all those sorts of things, it invested those monies to rebuild. What USET, Sovereignty Protection Fund, has proposed, partly in response to the Broken Promises report that was issued by the United States Commission on Civil Rights, 2018, which was preceded by the Quiet Crisis report in 2003, which speaks to unfulfilled trust and treaty obligations. We have proposed a visionary thing. Why not a Marshall Plan for Indian country? If we are willing to make an investment internationally, why are we not willing to make the same investment domestically? And that goes back to my earlier point about that will not just benefit us, because the reality is we are also American citizens. We are sovereigns that reside within the domestic borders of the United States. How is a stronger Indian country not beneficial to the United States? It would be. Without a doubt, it would be. But you have to prioritize that. So this is not a matter of can we do it? It's a matter of do we want to do it? Are we going to honor that first promise that we made all those years ago? And we would contend that the answer was a resounding yes, we should. So we invite all of you to learn more about that, to be part of that change effort to achieve that objective. Last November 2021, the USET Sovereignty Protection Fund submitted comments to the Department of Interior concerning homelands, protection, and restoration. As part of that testimony, we stated, in large part to the wonderful writing of Ms. Malerba sitting at this table over here, tribal land base is a core aspect of tribal sovereignty, cultural identity, and represents the foundation of our tribal economies. It is incumbent upon the federal government to prioritize and defend the restoration of our land bases, including sacred sites and cultural sites. USET SPF member tribal nations continue to work to reacquire our homelands, which are fundamental to our existence as sovereign governments and our ability to thrive as vibrant, healthy, self-sufficient communities. However, we face numerous barriers to the just return and control of our homelands, including a burdensome, complicated, and protracted land into trust process, the inequity resulting from the Supreme Court decision in Cartcherry versus Salazar, unjust challenges from private citizens and other units of government, and the application of archaic laws that refuse to recognize our status as sovereign governments. These places are often the sites of our origin stories, our places of creation. As such, we believe that we have been in these places since time immemorial. Through these sites, we are inextricably linked to our spirituality, the practice of our religions, and to the foundations of our cultural beliefs and values. Our sacred sites are of greatest importance as they hold the bones and spirits of our ancestors, and we must ensure their protection, and that is our sacred duty. The song playing right now is the Micmac Honor Song. It was composed by Micmac Elder George Paul. In talking about the motivation behind composing this song, he speaks of forgotten history amongst our people and the pain associated with what we have lost. Land, resources, language, culture. Ultimately, the meaning of this song's message roughly translates into English: let us honor the people that we are. My people, let us come together. Let us honor our ancestry, our bloodlines. My people, let us help one another. Let us help one another in the manner that the Creator has placed us here upon Mother Earth. His hope was for all of us to respect each other as a human family. So in closing, while we cannot change the course of events that occurred throughout our history, we have the power and opportunity to write the story as we move forward. While the actions throughout history attempted to remove and disconnect us from our lands, we are still here. Most importantly, out of respect for our ancestors who fought so hard to give us the opportunity to still be here today, we will fight to protect these lands, reclaim our rightful place, and rebuild our homelands to ensure a bright and prosperous future. Thank you once again for this opportunity, and thank you all for your hard work and support in achieving our vision. Nia Ish.
much, Kitcki. What some of you may not know is this man has done a tremendous job as not only as executive director of USET, but as the president of the Sovereignty Protection Fund. And he works tirelessly for the tribes that are under his jurisdiction and other tribes to advocate for our sovereignty and to make sure that our rights are being observed. And so I want to thank you for that. As a national leader in Indian country, we are so grateful to be under the USET protection. Thank you. At this time, we're right on schedule, I think. We're so proud to have Mr. Garriott here from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He's the Deputy Assistant Secretary, is that correct? Principal, Deputy Assistant Secretary. I knew it was 3 or 4 names. The government really names you good, don't they? They don't want you to forget who you are. Has agreed to grace us with his presence this afternoon, and he's going to be speaking on taking land into trust and the programs that the Bureau of Indian Affairs has to help tribes manage and maintain those lands. So thank you so much for coming. Let's have a hand for Mr. Garriott.
Hamidakebi, Iha Chantewa Stenape Chuzapalo. Wizipan Emachapalona, Sichangu Lakota Hemachana, Ashke Gluipi Tioshpai Emataha. Honaleon Petukile, Iha Eawachianke, Cha Chantema Washte. Oyuka Le Mokocheki Ea Ikchewichasha. Wana ake yuhapi cha lila chantema washte. Good afternoon. I greet each and every one of you with a good heart. My name is Wizipan Elk Garriott. I serve as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs at the U.S. Department of the Interior. I come from the Sichangu Lakota Nation, also known as the Rosebud Sioux tribe. And within my tribe, I come from the Rat Tear Band. It's amazing to be here, and I'm so honored to be here, to see friends, to be here on these lands. This is my second time working at the U.S. Department of Interior. I worked in the Obama administration very early on. And the last time I worked here, there were no federally recognized tribes in Virginia. And I come back and there are federally recognized tribes in Virginia. And of course, we know that they've always been here, whether they were federally recognized or not. They've always been here. The people have always been here. And they have always maintained a connection to the land, even when they didn't have any official title to that land, legal title to that land. They've still been here and still maintain that. And so it's so inspiring to be here and to hear about and to see highlighted some of the wonderful and amazing and innovative projects that the tribes are doing here and that they're leading here. In my role, I serve under the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, and we oversee the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Bureau of Indian Education, and the Bureau of Trust Funds Administration, and a number of other offices that are operated directly under Indian Affairs. In total, we have about 7,000 employees or so, and we work with all 574 federally recognized tribes across the country. We also fund many tribal programs through what are called Indian self-determination contracts, in which instead of us as the federal government providing direct services to tribes, we contract with the tribe, and the tribe provides those services for itself, for their own community. And so we operate in both of these areas. On the education side, we fund and or operate over 160 schools throughout the country, and we educate over 44,000 Indian students across the country. And the Bureau of Trust Funds Administration administers, I think right now we're getting close to about $7 billion in trust funds on behalf of tribes and individuals, Indians. We are pretty much involved in everything except the direct administration of healthcare services, which is handled by the Indian Health Service. One of the most unique parts of our job and parts of our duty in adhering and honoring our unique trust responsibility to Indian nations is assisting and working with tribes in managing 56 million acres of trust lands across the country and close to 60 million acres of subsurface mineral rights across the country. And we work directly with tribes in a number of ways. Some tribes have decided to take over a lot of the functions around the management of those lands, and in some areas we have a more direct hand in managing those trust lands on behalf of tribes and individuals. Today, you're hearing about conservation and a lot of the work that's happening around conservation and the unique opportunities that the conservation community and tribes and philanthropy can undertake to meet shared interests and shared goals. And I'm going to focus a lot on that and in that area. This, of course, is a priority of the Biden administration. It's a priority of Secretary Haaland, and it's a priority that I think that we're putting a lot of work and energy into, and that it's being backed up by actions and investment. We're very excited about the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act, which of course builds upon the bipartisan infrastructure law, which overall provides the greatest historic investment into tribes this country has ever seen from a fiscal standpoint, as well as a historic investment into combating climate change and forwarding conservation. In total, between both of those bills, we've seen well over $20 billion being invested into tribes, and specifically, we're looking to invest over $400 million into tribal climate and conservation work in the coming years. One of the things that the president ran on and that he talked about and has made a priority is taking land into trust. And as a part of that, last year in November, President Biden announced the Tribal Homelands Initiative. And essentially what this initiative is about is supporting tribes in strengthening their homelands, in building upon their homelands, and where possible, helping tribes for the first time reacquire homelands. And this initiative is underpinned by four kind of policies and four kind of sub-initiatives. First is Indigenous knowledge. Last year, the White House issued a memorandum directing federal land management agencies to take into account and consideration traditional ecological knowledge. That term is advancing somewhat, and we're now referring to it as just simply Indigenous knowledge. And Indigenous knowledge is a set of knowledge that Indigenous people have accumulated, researched, and experimented, and are continuing to gain over thousands and thousands of years. Indigenous people have been the first people on these lands, and they bring a lot to the table, and not only from a historical perspective, but are continuing to add and build upon their knowledge today. And so this memo directed us as federal land managers to not only take Indigenous knowledge into account when we're making decisions, but to also place it and give it the same weight as Western science and in our decision-making processes. And so over the last year, and we're going to continue to be working to say, okay, we've been given a very high-level guidance. How are we going to further implement it into our policies, procedures, and land management practices? And so that's where it starts, is the acknowledgement that Indigenous people have been here and that they have something unique to offer that only Indigenous people can offer. Second was a joint secretarial order on co-stewardship of federal lands with tribes. This was a secretarial order issued by Secretary Holland and by Secretary Vilsack of the USDA. And essentially what this order directed, it directed the Department of Interior and the USDA to start seeking co-stewardship agreements with tribes, and at the same time to find ways to acquire land for tribes and to support that process. Now, co-stewardship is a broad set of practices, authorities, agreements that can be negotiated and worked between tribes and federal land managers, like, for example, the Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Park Service. Tribes have always maintained and continue to maintain historical and cultural and ceremonial ties to the lands, and sometimes also have treaty rights to certain parts of lands. And just because it's owned and managed by the federal government doesn't mean that the tribes don't maintain and still need access to be able to continue to live and practice their life ways that they've practiced for thousands of years. And so co-stewardship is a way to bring tribes to the table, the same table as federal decision makers, in deciding how those lands are going to be managed. It can be something that is very heavy and intensive, where there's a contract or a self-determination contract administered between a federal land manager and directly with the tribe for the provision of some kind of service. Or it could be an MOU or MOA between the federal decision makers, between the federal government and tribes, to provide access or cultural interpretation. It can also be joint decision-making bodies, where the decisions are made in cooperation and consultation and cooperation with tribes and the federal government. And so it's a very broad set of of practices and agreements that tribes have access to and that we as federal land managers also have access to further these goals. At the same time, we also announced an interagency memorandum of agreement on the protection of sacred sites to begin strengthening tribes' access and the protection of those sites that are sacred to them, as well as another interagency memorandum of agreement on the protection and increasing access to treaty rights. And again, we're talking about hunting and gathering and other treaty rights that tribes may have. Together, these 4 announcements have provided the North Star, the guide star for the department as we continue to do our work in working with tribes. At the same time, we're also at the Indian Affairs level taking steps and taking action to amend our regulations to make it easier for tribes to take land into trust. Now, a lot of times people think, when a tribe gets land, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to develop it or put a casino on it. Well, that happens very rarely. The majority of the time, when tribes take land into trust, it's for agricultural or other purposes. And oftentimes, it's done for conservation. And so under our new regulations that we're developing, we're making it explicitly clear that tribes can take land into trust for conservation purposes. Now, we just heard about a great example in which a tribe has done that. And for those tribes that want to take those kinds of action and to acquire land and put it into trust, and then for a conservation purpose, that should be a very clear and easy option for the tribe. Taking land into trust, co-stewardship, these are not actions that simply benefit the tribe. Yes, the tribe has interests. Sometimes they have rights, they have legal rights. But it is a benefit for the federal government, and it is a benefit for the American people. Because, again, in many instances, tribes are among the best land managers in the world. They've been doing it for longer, and they're better at it. Tribes also bring, in many instances, because of their indigenous knowledge, a different way of thinking about land management that in many instances is longer term. Oftentimes we hear tribes talk about 7 generations, being able to think about the best interests of our grandchildren's grandchildren and making decisions that benefit them. And so when we bring that knowledge and that expertise to the table in managing our public lands, that benefits everybody. And so this is not just about doing right by tribes. This is about doing right by everyone. Now these, as you heard, these kinds of initiatives cannot be done or really in a vacuum. There's many stakeholders. You have federal stakeholders, you have the tribe, tribal individuals, you have the local community, local governments, and other interests. And so it becomes important for us to think about how are we going to all work together? How are we going to put our minds together to move these shared interests and shared visions forward in a way that doesn't leave anybody out and that is of mutual benefit to everybody. And so we are also working to establish an Office of Public-Private Partnerships, where we begin working with conservation community, where we begin working with NGOs and philanthropy to begin bridging the conservation and NGO philanthropic world together with tribes. Now, many tribes continue to struggle with capacity and simply having the resources to put big conservation deals together and to go through the process of strengthening and protecting their homelands. And I think that this is an amazing opportunity where the philanthropic world and the NGO world can come and together with tribes and to help provide those much needed resources to help tribes build their capacity and to provide technical assistance to tribes in the pursuit of these kinds of endeavors. On the other side, we've heard many times from over and over again from the philanthropic and NGO world and the conservation world, we don't know who to work with. We don't have a lot of experience in working with tribes. Well, we have a lot of experience working with tribes. And so between the federal government, the tribe, and NGOs, we can bring all parties together, and NGOs can start directing and more resources and working directly with tribes. And the tribe wants to protect and preserve the land. It's the same thing that a lot of the conservation community does. And quite frankly, in many instances, that's what we want to do as the federal government. So all our interests are aligned. And so let's begin to build and bridge those gaps. And so that is going to be a very key strategy of ours in the next several years as we move forward. And we're going to be very deliberate about this. We've already started some of this work where we've begun working directly with tribes and directly with NGOs, philanthropy, to begin connecting them. And we're going to be doing this work in three areas: conservation, education, and economic development. And so we have kind of three areas that we're working in. And the most developed is in the conservation side. When we first heard about the work that was happening with the Rappahannock Nation and the Fonzie Cliffs, we became very, very excited, because we were like, this is exactly what we want to do. This is a model. The tribe's doing it. This is the model that can be developed and implemented and expanded throughout the country. We've seen other models of this. We've done an incredible amount of work around Bears Ears. And again, that's an intertribal coalition that had a lot of support from the conservation community. And it also involves two federal agencies, not only Department of Interior, but USDA as well. And there are many, many other tribes throughout the country that have expressed an interest in moving this work forward. And we're incredibly excited about that. Now, it's one thing for folks who wear suits and, I guess I can't really say ties, suits and medallions, sitting in offices in Washington, D.C. to talk about this, right? And so we can, push out all the secretary orders we want, but unless it's implemented in the field, it's not going to have its full impact and full effect. And so this week we were excited and really pleased to announce that the Bureau of Land Management, the National Park Service, and the Fish and Wildlife Service has issued director's orders on co-stewardship. And so what this means is that we're taking the secretarial order that provides kind of priority and a big goal. Now we've issued guidance that gets put out into the field directly from the directors on how co-stewardship should be pursued and implemented while providing the legal authorities and mechanisms on which to negotiate these co-stewardship agreements. And we just announced that this week. And so we're very excited about that. And over the coming months are going to be working to ensure that our employees at the unit level get an understanding and training in how to implement these directors' orders. Because this is work that we want to live on. This is work that needs to be known by all. The Department of Interior is a big organization. We have 65,000 plus employees. And to be able to communicate that across all of our employees in all the states, is a lot in a big order. And so we need to be able to take the very high level priorities and step it down and step it down and step it down so that this becomes a permanent part of how we do business. I heard somebody say that we want this co-stewardship to be the norm and not the exception. And so the administration and under the leadership of Secretary Holland and others, we're working diligently to be able to pull all of this together. Now, I had the honor and privilege of attending the event with Secretary Holland when the Rappahannock deal was announced, and it was wonderful. And I remember having a conversation with Chief Ann and with Joel as well, and saying, why didn't you just give the money to the tribe and have the tribe buy it? And then put it directly into trust for conservation. That is an option. And I think from a tribal perspective, would probably be the preferred option. Every tribe is going to be different. They're going to want to do things in their own way. But I think that you can cut out a step in that process. It also is an acknowledgement of the tribe and is an acknowledgement of the tribe as a sovereign. And I think it also provides some other benefits. The tribes are nations. Especially in this part of the world, these relationships predate the formation of the United States. There were actually treaties signed with the colonies. There were treaties signed with other nations. And there were treaties signed with the United States government. And so that relationship is one that is on a nation-to-nation basis, and it's one that is on a government-to-government basis. And tribes bring a different kind of authority and legitimacy, as well as some unique legal and policy authorities that others don't. And when we're looking and considering the full spectrum of how to protect tribes, how to conserve land, tribal nations, tribal governments can play an incredibly powerful and key role in that process. Not only bringing their indigenous knowledge, but bringing some unique relationships that others just don't have. Only a tribe has that. We have obligations as the federal government to consult with tribes on a government-to-government basis, on a nation-to-nation basis. And so we have an opportunity before us. I think we're at a pivotal point in our country where we can begin to think about how are we going to collectively work together to tackle some of the biggest challenges facing our country. And the more that we can bring tribes, tribal nations to the decision-making table as partners, as co-equal partners, we can do incredible and unprecedented things. And that's the opportunity that we have. We can see what happened here with the Fonzie Cliffs happen over and over again, not only here, but throughout the country. But it's going to take a little bit of bravery. It's going to take some bold action. It's going to take some investment. And it's going to take a little bit of thinking outside the box. And this administration has proven that we're ready to be partners with tribes in this journey of co-stewardship and of helping to build and strengthen tribal homelands. So I want to thank Chief Ann and the other tribes for inviting me. I don't know how much time I've taken, almost a half hour. I'd be happy to answer a few questions if there are any questions, and then give the remainder of the time back.
I just encourage you to think nimble and think about how you can respond more quickly to opportunities as they arise. So as you're redoing your regulation.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Believe me, we've had meetings on appraisals many times.
So my question actually has to do with durability, and not durability of land conservation, but for the programs that you're putting into place now, how do we make sure that they stay in place through whatever administrations come our way, and we don't lose that? Because I think it's I'm with a non-governmental organization, but we would love to commit to this long term, but also struggle to understand how long we can commit to this sorts of effort once the administration changes.
So I think two things. I think one, what we're working towards is, really a shift in the way that we fundamentally do business. And, we do that by, taking the kinds of actions that we've been taking, right? Secretary order, we've just issued these director's orders. Those get implemented in the field. And, our employees, the folks that work in the field, they're there for a long time. I think the other partner is a tribe, right? That when that relationship is built with the tribe is going to be around for a long time. Tribes have been around since time immemorial, and they're going to continue. And so, in addition to, ensuring that we have, a good relationship with the federal government, it's also really important that they have a good working relationship with the tribe. I just was talking to a tribal member today, and she was a little bit younger, probably in her 30s, and I was asking her about, well, how did you do this work with the National Park Service? And she said, well, these relationships were built by my elders 20 years ago. And so I didn't build these relationships, but it's my duty to continue those relationships and to continue to nurture them. And so this work doesn't happen overnight. And sometimes it's going to take a while, and that's okay. and some of the work spans several generations, and that's okay. And so, again, when we think about this idea of durability, I think working with the tribe and continuing to work with the tribe and building those relationships year over year is going to be one of the keys to success. Anything else? Oh.
Hi, my name is Reggie Tuppins. I'm an enrolled citizen of Upper Mattaponi. I'm also the tribal administrator, as well as the vice president for Southeast Region for NCAI. I listened to your testimony yesterday, and a couple of the congressmen were asking about the restricted fee versus fee to trust. So for us, we had land taken into trust, 2 different parcels in April of this year, the first in Virginia. And what would you say the administration's position is on fee to trust versus restricted fee? I know that mostly the northeastern tribes have, several of those have properties in restricted fee. And, you know, is that an opportunity? I personally like the idea because it leaves the ownership, you know, in the tribe as opposed to in the U.S. government.
I think tribes do best when tribes make their own decisions, and so I think that the more that the tribe makes a decision on how they would like to manage that land and the status of that land is always going to be best. And so some tribes would prefer to have land into trust, and if a tribe wants to have it in a different status, that's fine too. I think the big thing is that, and the most important thing is that we're listening as much as we can and being as responsive as we can to the wishes and needs of the tribe.
To what extent does the BIA have over the grant process? I mean, I know we get grants from different agencies, but some of the competitive grants, for instance, the Indian Community Development Block Grant is very competitive, and there's a distinct advantage to those tribes that have been in existence a long time who have infrastructure within their tribe to write grants. And a lot of them will say, we experience in these areas with expertise in a certain area, and you get a certain amount of points based on the expertise, but there's no money in there to help you contract the expertise to fill the void that you have. And it's kind of like you apply for a job, and one consideration is you must have 5 years work experience. Well, how do you get experience if you don't get the job? So the point that I'm making really is that those competitive grants, I feel, are skewed heavily toward those tribes who have established infrastructure. And we need to somehow level the playing field. And I'm Stephen Atkins, Chief of the Chickahominy Indian Tribe.
Thank you, Chief. You're raising something that we've definitely heard many times over, right? There's a lot of programs out there. Some are specifically for tribes, and some are general programs for which tribes are eligible for as well. There are very few block grant programs. Many of the programs are competitive, and we need to do a better job in terms of in several areas. One, and I'm speaking kind of across the federal government, not just Interior, is they're hard to find, hard to identify. Before joining the administration, I ran our tribe's Economic Development Corporation, and we had an affiliated nonprofit. And we spent a lot of time and energy and resources just finding the grants, right? And then once you find them, then you got to figure out how you're going to write a competitive application to get the money. And that requires, like you said, time and experience. resources, and it's like, well, how do you get the resources to go after the resources? and so it can be incredibly frustrating and expensive. One thing that I'm really excited about is this week, the Office of Management and Budget just announced that for the first time in history, they are appointing a tribal affairs advisor. And so Liz Carr will be stepping into that role. She's incredible. And I really think that we're going to be able to see some movement in terms of kind of the overall tribal budgeting process, as well as how tribal funds are administered, and so believe me, I hear you from some direct experience in terms of how challenging that can be, Chief.
Thank you.
Anything else? Well, I don't see anything anymore, and so I just want to again express gratitude and appreciation to all of you for all of your work and for allowing me to come today and share some of our some thoughts and announcements about some of our work. And I hope that this isn't the last time that I get to see all of you. So again, thank you to all of you.
Also put this in a position that we have to respond to Indian Child Welfare Act cases. And the money that some folks are grandfathered in, but us Lee Clive had no funds in order to do that work. And without the pro bono services we're getting from established law firms, we wouldn't be able to surmount the challenges incumbent in taking an Indian Child Welfare Act to closure. So we need some help funding these new tribes to give us the capabilities to field these Indian Child Welfare Act cases. Thank you, and I'm sorry I dropped the last one.
I'll come find you right after.